The wind at Cedar Bluff National Cemetery had a way of cutting through whatever you were wearing, no matter the season. It came off the plains to the west, flat and relentless, carrying the smell of cattle ranches and sun-baked soil, and something older, something that had been blowing across this stretch of Oklahoma long before anyone thought to plant white headstones in rows across its red earth. On this particular morning in early November, the wind was sharp enough to make Rachel Kingsley regret her decision to wear heels. She stood near the temporary stage, clipboard pressed against her chest, scanning the gathering crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had organized every civic event in Cimarron County for the past 11 years. Today was different from the usual Veterans Day ceremony. Today was the unveiling of the Shadow Ridge Memorial Wall, a long overdue tribute to the 14 men of a declassified Army unit ODA 7216, who had been killed during a series of operations in Laos and Cambodia between 1968 and 1971. Operations that, until 18 months ago, the United States government had refused to acknowledge ever happened. Rachel had spent 8 months planning this event. She had coordinated with the Department of Defense, the governor's office, 2 congressional representatives, and a retired 4-star general who would be delivering the keynote. She had arranged for 6 of the 14 families to attend, tracked down through decades-old records, and a small army of genealogists. She had commissioned the granite wall herself, working with a sculptor in Tulsa to etch each name with the unit's unofficial insignia, a coiled rattlesnake over a broken compass. She had thought of everything. What she had not thought of was the old man standing 20 feet from the covered wall, his hands in the pockets of a canvas ranch coat that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times and dried in the sun, every one of them. He wore no hat despite the wind, and his hair, what was left of it, was white and cropped close to his scalp in a way that might have been military once, but now just looked like a man who cut his own hair with kitchen scissors. His boots were the dusty roper kind you saw on every rancher from here to Amarillo, cracked at the toe and worn pale at the heel. He stood perfectly still, staring at the covered memorial as if he could see through the canvas draping. Rachel approached him with the efficient stride she used for problems that needed solving quickly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move back to the public seating area. This section is reserved for the families of the honored soldiers and invited guests." The old man turned his head. His eyes were a dark, steady gray, the color of river stones after rain. There was nothing hostile in them, nothing confused. They simply regarded her with a patience that felt, in a way she couldn't articulate, like being measured. "I'm fine right here," he said. His voice was quiet, with the unhurried cadence of a man who had long ago stopped feeling any need to raise it. "I understand you'd like to be close to the ceremony," Rachel said, the diplomatic smile locked in place, "but we have a seating chart and a security perimeter for a reason. The governor will be arriving shortly, and his detail needs this area clear. There's a wonderful view from the general's seating." She pointed toward the rows of white folding chairs set up 50 yards back, already half filled with townspeople, and a scattering of veterans in ball caps and leather vests. The old man followed her gesture with his eyes but didn't move. He looked back at the covered wall. "I knew them," he said simply. Rachel's smile didn't waver. She heard this at every memorial event. Half the county claimed to have served with someone, known someone, lost someone. It was the currency of small-town remembrance, and she respected it. She genuinely did, but she couldn't let every person who felt a connection stand in the VIP area. The logistics alone would be a nightmare. "Many people in this community have connections to our honored fallen," she said warmly, "and we've made sure everyone will have a chance to view the wall after the ceremony. But right now, I really do need you to step back." The old man looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod, slow and deliberate, and took 3 steps backward. Not to the public seating. Just 3 steps. Enough to satisfy the letter of her request. He positioned himself beside a gnarled post oak, its branches mostly bare, and resumed his vigil over the covered memorial. Rachel, seeing movement and interpreting it as compliance, turned on her heel and hurried toward the stage, where a sound technician was struggling with a feedback loop in the speaker system. She did not notice the way the old man's right hand, the one she couldn't see, was trembling. Sergeant First Class Noah Stroud noticed. He'd been watching the exchange from his position near the eastern edge of the ceremony grounds, where he stood in dress greens with 3 other active duty soldiers assigned as honor guard for the event. Stroud was 29, a Green Beret with 2 deployments to Syria and 1 to Niger under his belt. And he had the particular kind of alertness that came from years of operating in environments where missing a detail could cost you your life. He had spotted the old man 10 minutes ago, before Rachel Kingsley had. What caught Stroud's eye wasn't the clothes or the weathered face, it was the way the man breathed. Slow, controlled, a 4-count inhale, a measured exhale. It was tactical breathing, the kind they taught at the JFK Special Warfare Center, the kind that became second nature only after years of using it under actual duress. Nobody breathed like that casually. Nobody breathed like that unless it had been beaten into their nervous system by repetition and necessity. Stroud also noticed the man's hands. Even from this distance, he could see the thickened knuckles, the particular flatness of the outer palm that came from thousands of hours of hand-to-hand combat training. And there was something else, something about the way the man stood at the base of that tree. He wasn't leaning against it. He wasn't using it for shelter from the wind. He was using it as cover. Unconsciously, instinctively, the man had positioned himself so that the trunk broke up his silhouette, made him harder to see from the stage, from the parking lot, from every natural line of approach. It was the behavior of a man who had spent a very long time not wanting to be found. Stroud's team leader, a young captain named Adler, caught him staring. "You know that guy?" "No," Stroud said, "but someone should." The ceremony began at 1100 hours sharp. The governor arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows, flanked by 2 state troopers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. He shook hands with Rachel Kingsley, posed for a photograph with the families seated in the front row, and took his seat on the stage next to Congressman Hubbard, a third-term representative who had championed the declassification effort and made sure everyone knew it. The opening remarks were delivered by a local pastor who spoke in broad, comforting generalities about sacrifice and God's plan. Then Congressman Hubbard took the microphone and spent 12 minutes talking about transparency, accountability, and the sacred trust between a nation and its warriors. He used the phrase, "these brave men," 9 times. He did not use any of their names. Stroud stood at rigid attention through all of it, his gaze fixed forward, but his peripheral vision tracked the old man under the tree. The rancher hadn't moved. He stood with the same unsettling stillness, his gray eyes watching the speakers without visible reaction. But when the congressman said the words, "covert operations in Southeast Asia," Stroud saw something shift. The old man's jaw tightened, just barely. A compression of muscle so slight that anyone not trained in reading micro-expressions would have missed it entirely. It was the look of a man hearing his own life, described by someone who had no idea what it had actually been. The keynote speaker was General Lewis Martin, retired, a 4-star who had served as Chalk commander in the early 2000s. He was 81 years old, and he walked to the podium with the careful deliberation of a man who refused to use a cane out of sheer stubbornness. His speech was different from the others. It was shorter, quieter, and it had the weight of genuine knowledge behind it. OTA 7216, the general began, was never supposed to exist. It was formed in 1967 under a program so classified that the men who served in it could not tell their wives, their parents, or their children what they did. They could not wear their decorations. They could not seek treatment for their wounds at military hospitals without cover stories. When they died, their families were told it was training accidents, vehicle rollovers, equipment failures. 14 men died in those jungles, and for over 50 years, this country looked their families in the eye and lied about how. The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to pull back for a moment. "Today, we give them their names back," the general continued. "We give them the truth. But I want to be honest with you. I didn't serve with these men. I came after. What I know about 7216, I learned from files and debriefs and the occasional old soldier who'd had enough whiskey to let something slip. I can tell you facts, but I cannot tell you what it was like. That knowledge belongs to someone else." He paused, and Stroud saw the general's eyes move, just for a fraction of a second, toward the crowd. Not to the VIP seating, not to the families, to the edges, searching. Then the moment passed, and the general cleared his throat and continued. "Let us unveil the memorial." Rachel Kingsley gave the signal. 2 soldiers in white gloves pulled the canvas draping from the wall in a single, practiced motion. The crowd exhaled. The wall was beautiful, 8 feet of polished black granite, the names carved deep into the stone in clean block letters. 14 names. Below each name, a date of birth and a date of death. Below the dates, the unit designation. Above the names, the coiled rattlesnake and broken compass etched in silver leaf. There was a long moment of silence. Then the families began to weep. A woman in the front row, white-haired and frail, pressed her fingers to her lips and rocked forward in her chair. Beside her, a man in his 50s, her son, put his arm around her shoulders. 2 rows back, a younger woman held a folded flag against her chest, a flag that had been given to her grandmother decades ago for a death that had supposedly happened in a motor pool in Fort Bragg. It was during this silence that the old man began to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He stayed right where he was, beside the post oak, his hands now out of his pockets and hanging at his sides. But in the stillness of the moment, his voice carried with the clarity of a bell struck once in an empty church. Jessup Carl David. Born March 3, 1944 in Bowman, North Dakota. Married to Eleanor. Had a boy named Timothy who was 2 years old when Carl shipped out. Carl played the harmonica. Badly. We used to tell him the enemy could hear him coming from 3 clicks out. The words landed on the crowd like stones dropped into still water. Heads turned. Rachel Kingsley looked up from her clipboard, her mouth slightly open. The old man's gaze was fixed on the wall, reading the names, though Stroud realized with a chill that the man wasn't reading them at all. He was reciting from memory. His eyes were closed. Womack Raymond Lee. Born June 19, 1943 in Shelby, Mississippi. Had a sister named Delia who sent him pecan pralines every month. Ray was our point man, best nose in the unit, could smell a tripwire before he could see it. Saved us 11 times by my count. On the 12th, the wire was buried too deep. A sound came from the family section, a gasp, then a moan. A woman, mid-70s, had her hand pressed flat against her sternum as though trying to hold her heart inside her chest. Delia, she whispered. I'm Delia. The old man's voice didn't falter. Kendricks, Samuel Amos. Born August 8, 1946, in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Sammy was the youngest, 19 when he came to us. He carried a photograph of a girl named Rose in a waterproof pouch taped to his chest. He said she didn't know he existed. He was going to tell her when he got home. Oh God, someone said, low and broken. Oh my God, Batista Fernando Reyes. Born November 12, 1941, in Laredo, Texas. Nando was our medic. He could set a bone in the dark with no anesthesia and talk you through it so gently you forgot to scream. He kept a St. Christopher medal in his boot. I found it after. I kept it for 30 years before I could bring myself to mail it to his mother. Rachel Kingsley was frozen. She had stopped managing. She had stopped thinking about the schedule, the governor, the seating chart. She was staring at this old man in his faded ranch coat, and the certainty growing in her chest felt like falling. The old man continued, name by name. 14 names. For each one, he offered a birth date, a hometown, a family detail that was nowhere in any official record, and a memory so specific, so intimate, that it could only have come from someone who had been there, who had lived alongside them, who had watched them die. By the 8th name, the crowd was weeping openly. By the 11th, 2 of the family members had left their seats and were walking, slowly as if drawn by gravity, toward the old man under the tree. By the 14th name, the last name, his voice broke for the first time. Ostrander Paul William. Born February 2, 1945, in Rapid City, South Dakota. Paul was my radio operator. He was the funniest man I ever knew. He could do an impression of every officer in the chain of command, and he once made a North Vietnamese interrogator laugh so hard the man forgot what he was doing for 15 seconds. Paul died carrying me. I took 2 rounds through the hip, and he threw me over his shoulder and ran 400 meters through open ground. He was hit 6 times. He did not stop running until he reached the tree line. Then he set me down, looked me in the eye and said, "Sarge, I believe this is your stop." And then he sat down against a tree and closed his eyes. The old man opened his eyes. They were bright with tears, but his voice, when it came again, was steady. He was 26 years old. Silence, absolute silence. Even the wind. Then General Lewis Martin did something no one expected. The 81-year-old 4-star general stepped down from the stage, ignoring the hand that Congressman Hubbard extended to help him. He walked across the grass, his dress shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth, and he walked directly to the old man. He stopped 3 feet away, and for a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. "You're Sayers," the general said, not a question. The old man gave a slight nod. "Emmett Sayers, Master Sergeant. They told me you were dead. The file said killed in action, 1971, body not recovered." "The file was convenient," Sayers said quietly. The general's face worked through something complicated. disbelief, recognition, and then a sorrow so deep it seemed to age him another 10 years in the space of a breath. 3 years, the general said. They held you for 3 years. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, Sayers said. But who's counting? The general turned to face the crowd. His voice, when he raised it, was not the polished baritone of his keynote speech. It was raw, stripped of ceremony, the voice of a soldier speaking to other soldiers across the unbridgeable distance of time. Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard from the man this wall should have been built for. Master Sergeant Emmett Sayers was the operational commander of ODA 7216. Every man whose name is on that granite, he led them, he trained them, he fought beside them, and when they fell, he carried them out, every single one. He brought their bodies home when the United States government would not even admit they were there. He paused. His hand was shaking. He steadied it by gripping the lapel of his coat. In 1971, Master Sergeant Sayers was captured during an extraction that went wrong. He was listed as killed in action. His name was entered into a classified database and buried. He spent over 3 years in a prison camp in Laos that does not appear on any map. When he was recovered in 1974, during a covert operation that is still classified to this day, he weighed 119 pounds. He had been beaten so severely that he had lost hearing in his left ear and could not straighten his right hand. The general looked down at Sayers' hands, the right one, the one that had been trembling. The fingers were slightly curled, permanently, the knuckles misaligned in a way that spoke of bones broken and rebroken and never properly set. When he was debriefed, the general continued, the first thing he asked about was not himself, not his medical condition, not his back pay or his decorations or his future. The first thing he asked was whether the families had been told the truth about how their men had died. When he was told they had not, that the cover stories were still in place, he refused to cooperate with the debrief until someone promised him the families would be notified. The general's voice hardened. No one ever kept that promise, until today. He turned back to Sayers. Why didn't you come forward all these years? Why didn't you demand recognition? Sayers looked past the general, at the wall, at the names cut into black stone. Recognition, he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it insufficient. Those boys didn't get recognition. They got a lie and a folded flag. Anything I got would have been built on top of that lie. I didn't want it. So you just disappeared? I went home, bought 40 acres outside of Enid, raised cattle, fixed fences. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. There's a dignity in fence work, General. You can see what you've built at the end of the day. You can see what you're protecting. Stroud, still at attention, felt something hot and tight building behind his eyes. He was a Green Beret. He had been trained by instructors who had been trained by instructors who had been trained by men like this. Every tactical doctrine he knew, every principle of unconventional warfare, every lesson about leading indigenous forces and operating without support in denied territory, it all traced back, through an unbroken chain of teaching and suffering and knowledge, to operators like Emmett Sayers, men whose names had been redacted from the manuals they had written. The families had reached the old man now. Delia Womack, Raymond's sister, was the first. She was 76 years old and had spent 53 of those years not knowing how her brother had really died. She walked up to Sayers and took his crooked hand in both of hers. She didn't speak, she just held it and wept. Then came Margaret Kendricks, Samuel's niece, who had inherited the mystery of her uncle's death from her mother, who had gone to her own grave without answers. She stood before Sayers with her arms wrapped around herself, trembling. "The girl," she said, "Rose, did he ever get to tell her?" Sayers looked at her for a long moment. "Your uncle wrote a letter the night before the mission. He gave it to me for safekeeping. When I got home in '74, I drove to Parkersburg and found Rose Callahan. She'd married by then, had 2 kids. I gave her the letter." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. "She read it standing on her front porch," Sayers continued, "and then she sat down on the steps and cried for about an hour. Her husband came out and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and he didn't ask a single question. That was a good man she'd found." "Did she?" Margaret's voice caught. "Did she say anything about the letter?" She said, "I always knew. That's all. I always knew." One by one, the families came forward, and for each one, Emmett Sayers had something. A detail, a story, a piece of their loved one that had been locked inside this quiet rancher's memory for half a century, preserved with a fidelity that no file or database could match. He told Fernando Bautista's grandson that Nando used to sing corridos to himself while he worked on wounded men, and that his favorite was El Rey, and that his voice was terrible, but nobody ever asked him to stop because there was something in it that made you believe you were going to be all right. He told Carl Jessup's son Timothy, now a 60-year-old man with his father's jawline and his mother's eyes, that Carl had talked about him constantly, that Carl had carried a tiny pair of baby shoes in his rucksack, the first shoes Timothy had ever worn, and that Carl would take them out at night and hold them and just sit there in the dark, not saying anything, just holding those shoes like they were the most precious things on earth. Timothy Jessup, a retired high school teacher from Bismarck, who had grown up without a father and with a lie where the truth should have been, sank into a folding chair and put his face in his hands and sobbed with the abandon of a child who had finally, after 6 decades, been given permission to grieve. Rachel Kingsley stood at the edge of it all, her clipboard forgotten on the ground, her carefully constructed event shattered into something infinitely more real and infinitely more painful than anything she had planned. She watched this man, this old rancher she had tried to shoo away like a stray dog, hold the broken hearts of 14 families in his scarred and crooked hands, and she felt a shame so deep it was almost physical. She had spent 8 months building a monument. He had been one for 50 years. She walked toward him slowly, her heels sinking into the grass. The families parted for her, not because they recognized her authority, but because they saw the expression on her face, the naked humility of someone realizing how profoundly they had misjudged a situation. "Master Sergeant Sayers," she began, and her voice was small in a way it had never been. "I owe you an apology. I should have." "Ma'am," Sayers said, and there was no edge in his voice, no reproach, nothing but the weary gentleness of a man who had seen too much to waste any energy on resentment. "You built a fine wall. You put their names where people can see them. That's more than anyone did for 50 years. Don't apologize for doing your job." He looked around at the families, at the soldiers, at the crowd that had abandoned its seats and drifted forward as if pulled by something magnetic. Then he looked back at the wall. "I'd like a minute alone with them," he said. "If that's all right." Rachel nodded, unable to speak. The general touched her elbow and gently guided her back. The families retreated, slowly, reluctantly, each one looking over their shoulder as they went. And then it was just Emmett Sayers and the wall. He walked to it, his old roper boots making no sound on the grass. He reached up and laid his right hand, the broken one, flat against the granite. He started at the top left, at the first name, and he moved his hand slowly across the stone, touching each carved letter the way a blind man reads. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Whatever he was saying, it was not for anyone else to hear. Stroud watched from his position, tears running freely down his face, and he did not wipe them away. He understood, with a clarity that felt like revelation, that everything he had been taught about service and sacrifice and duty was standing right there in the form of a 73-year-old rancher with a broken hand and a canvas coat, talking to the ghosts of men he had never stopped carrying. General Martin stood beside Stroud, watching the same scene. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were bright. "You know what they never taught us at the War College?" the general said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That the hardest mission isn't the one where you might die. It's the one where you survive and everyone else doesn't, and then you have to live with it, quietly, without anyone knowing what you're carrying." He shook his head slowly. 50 years. 50 years he's been out there on some ranch, mending fences and feeding cattle, and every single day he's been carrying 14 men on his back. No medal for that, no ceremony, no wall. "Sir," Stroud said, "how did you know? When you looked at him, how did you know it was him?" The general was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't," he admitted. "I'd seen one photograph, black and white, taken in 1969. He was 30 years old in that picture. Lean, dark-haired, looked like he could kill you with a pencil. I wouldn't have recognized him from the photo." "Then how?" "His voice," the general said simply. "When he started naming those boys, the way he said each name, like he was calling roll one last time. I've listened to a recording of a radio transmission from Sayers' last mission. It was recovered in 2003 from a signals archive. On that tape, he's calling in an extraction under fire, and he's reading out the names of his casualties one by one, so that they'll be on the record even if he doesn't make it out. His voice on that tape sounds exactly like what you just heard. Same cadence, same weight on every syllable, like each name is a thing he's physically lifting." Stroud looked back at the wall. Sayers had finished his silent communion. He stood with both hands at his sides, his head bowed, and then he straightened up. He reached into the pocket of his ranch coat and pulled out something small. He knelt, his knees protesting audibly, and placed the object at the base of the wall, directly below the name Ostrander, Paul William. Stroud couldn't see what it was. Later, after everything was over, he would walk to the wall and find it. A St. Christopher medal, tarnished almost black with age, on a thin chain. Sayers had said he'd mailed Bautista's medal to the medic's mother, but he'd kept Ostrander's, the radio operator, the funny one, the one who had died carrying him. He'd kept it for 52 years, and now he was giving it back. Sayers stood, brushed off his knees, and turned away from the wall. He didn't look back at the crowd, the families, the general, or the soldiers. He walked the way he had stood, with a quiet, unshakable purpose, toward the gravel parking lot at the edge of the cemetery. His truck was there, an old Chevy with faded blue paint and a hay bale in the bed, parked at the very end of the last row, as far from the other vehicles as possible. Stroud took a half step forward, an instinct to follow, to say something, to acknowledge what he had just witnessed. But General Martin put a hand on his arm. "Let him go, son." "But sir, shouldn't we?" "What? Give him a medal? Put him on a stage? Read a speech about him?" The general's voice was not unkind, but it carried a firmness that closed the conversation. "That man has been carrying this alone for half a century, because that's what he chose. Because that's what the men on that wall would have expected of him. You don't take that from a man like Emmett Sayers. You just let him be who he is." They watched as the old rancher climbed into his truck, the door groaning on its hinges. The engine turned over with a rough cough, then settled into a low, steady rumble. He pulled out of the lot slowly, gravel crunching under bald tires, and turned onto the 2-lane highway that led west toward Enid and the 40 acres of fence line waiting for his attention. He did not wave. He did not look back. The ceremony was over, though no one tried to resume it. The governor and the congressman stood on the empty stage with nothing to say, their prepared remarks and talking points suddenly, laughably irrelevant. The families lingered at the wall, touching the names, some of them placing flowers, some just standing in silence, finally allowed to grieve for the truth instead of the lie. Rachel Kingsley picked up her clipboard from the grass, looked at it for a moment, and then set it down on a chair. She walked to the wall and stood in front of it, reading the names one more time, and this time each one had a face, a hometown, a pair of baby shoes, a bad harmonica, a letter never sent in time. She had organized the event. Emmett Sayers had given it meaning. Stroud remained at his post until the last family had departed. Then he walked to the wall, found the St. Christopher medal lying at the base of Paul Ostrander's name, and knelt beside it. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it. This small tarnished disc that had traveled from a dead medic's boot to a prison camp in Laos, to a cattle ranch in Oklahoma, to this square foot of earth at the base of a granite wall. Behind him, the wind picked up again, carrying the dry smell of the plains and the distant sound of a truck engine fading into the west. "You know," General Martin said, standing a few feet away, his gaze following the highway until it vanished into the horizon, "they'll probably try to find him now. The media, the Pentagon, everyone. They'll want to make him a story, put him on television, give him his moment." Stroud stood. "Will they find him?" The old general gave a short, quiet laugh, the kind that held no humor, only a deep and abiding respect. "Son, that man evaded the North Vietnamese army for 3 weeks in triple canopy jungle with 2 bullets in his hip and a broken hand. He spent 3 years in a camp that doesn't exist, and when he came home, he disappeared so completely that the entire United States intelligence community thought he was dead." The general shook his head, and something that might have been a smile, or might have been grief, crossed his weathered face. "If Emmett Sayers doesn't want to be found, he won't be." The sun was dropping toward the western edge of the plains, turning the sky the color of old brass. The white headstones of Cedar Bluff caught the light and held it, row after perfect row, and at the end of the newest row, the black granite wall stood with its 14 names, and its tarnished medal, and its coiled rattlesnake keeping watch over a silence that, for the first time in 50 years, was not a silence of secrets but a silence of peace. Somewhere west of there, past the cattle ranches and the fence rows and the red dirt roads that led to nowhere in particular, an old man in a faded coat drove home to 40 acres that needed tending, carrying 14 names in his chest the same way he always had, the way he always would, quietly, and without asking anyone to help him bear the weight.